My name's Graham Phillips. I'm the host of Catalyst, ABC TV television science program, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon. Welcome everybody, including Vice Chancellors, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Deans and Heads of Department. I'd also like to have a special welcome for Professor Ian Chubb, AC, our Chief Scientist, who's kindly made time to be with us this afternoon. I'd also like to acknowledge respectfully the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Ngunnawal people, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are present. So just before we start, on a personal note, I'd like to say this is a subject matter today that's very close to my heart. I've kind of devoted my career to trying to improve science literacy in the general community through science communication. But before that, I used to be a scientist. In fact, CSIRO was my last appointment. I did a PhD in applied maths at Monash University, and I've lectured maths at various universities around the country. But I guess more importantly, I put myself through university by tutoring high school maths to students there. So I guess I'll just initially share a couple of my observations before we move on to the experts here. But I guess for me and for a lot of students I've worked with, you know, one of the key things I think is inspirational teaching. And I don't necessarily mean charismatic inspirational teachers, but kind of that really great way of teaching and giving the big picture, broad view of what you're learning. And I was really lucky in year 11 to have a physics teacher who was brilliant at this. I mean, we had the regular physics curriculum that we went through, but he would also talk about black holes and time travel and Einstein's theory of relativity at the beginning of many of the classes, which was mind-blowing to all of us. And if we had a question about tachyons, particles that supposedly go faster than the speed of light, he would answer them, even though none of that stuff was on the curriculum. And it seemed to, that kind of inspiration that he gave most of us in that class, I'd say, was great to sort of get you through the more mundane aspects of physics and maths courses, which we all know are there. You kind of had this big picture view in mind, so it made it easier to deal with the sort of the drudgery of some of the more detailed stuff that you have to do, which I think is really important. And the other observation was about the maths students, the many maths students that I tutored. And this was a problem for so many of them, I think, is that, as we all know here, maths kind of builds on itself. So, it's like building a brick wall, if you like. You've got to learn all this stuff down the bottom, then you learn the next layer and the next layer. And if you miss some of those bricks down the bottom, then you're in serious strife, because you get to the next piece of information where you need something you missed. You don't fully understand that next level, so that kind of puts you off maths a little bit more. Then you get to the next level, you don't understand that, and eventually you can be pushed away from maths. And I think maths is kind of fairly unique in that kind of really regimented style for having to learn it. So I think that's perhaps a shortcoming with that traditional face-to-face class meeting that we have. Because it's very easy to miss classes. You can be sick for a couple of weeks and suddenly you find yourself left behind. But anyway, that's enough of my opinions. Today's symposium has been organised by the Australian Government Office for Learning and Teaching in conjunction with The Conversation. And I'm sure most of you will know The Conversation has been running a series of articles over the last 2 weeks on maths and science education. And the authors of 5 of those articles will be speaking to us later on. They're sitting at the panel there indeed. Now, today's proceedings are being broadcast live on the web, and whether you're sitting in the room here or watching over the internet, I encourage you to tweet your comments using hashtag MathSciEd. So that's MathSciEd. Now, the way this afternoon will unfold is, first up, we'll have a video address from Sharon Bird, the Minister for Higher Education, followed by a talk from our Chief Scientist, Professor Chubb. After that, each of the panel members will give a short presentation of their views on science and maths education. Then it's open to you guys and the wider world for questions. So look, I'll introduce the panel members first up. We have first, closest to me, Professor Merlin Crosley, Dean of Faculty of Science, the University of New South Wales. Dr. Jennifer Donovan, Lecturer in Education, University of Southern Queensland. Dr. Darren Soares, Laboratory Head, Garvan Institute. Dr. Rachel Grieve, Lecturer in Psychology, University of Tasmania. Dr. Chris Tisdell, Senior Lecturer, School of Mathematics and Statistics, University of New South Wales. And we'll also, after that, have a word from a student representative who might be sitting right here, I think. Jade Trul, President, National Union of Students and member of the OLT Strategic Advisory Committee. Well, look, first up, we will have that video message from the Honourable Sharon Bird MP, Minister for Higher Education.
Invited me to open this conversation. Unfortunately, other duties prevent you in person, but I welcome the opportunity to say a few brief words by video. The conversation is an initiative the Australian Government has been proud to support, and I also congratulate the Office for Learning and Teaching in my department for hosting this event. We all appreciate just how important maths and science are to our society and our economy. They help us understand, change and improve our world, and they underpin the innovation that will drive our economic transformation and secure our ongoing prosperity. The great challenge before us is to fully harness the power of maths and science and make the most of the potential they offer. And that's what today is really all about. We want to hear your views and draw upon your enthusiasm and expertise on some of the big and philosophical questions. For example, how do we maintain our commitment to maths and science? How can we best build mathematical and scientific knowledge and apply it for the benefit of future generations? How can maths and science best contribute to the way we work and live? And how can we ensure our schools and universities succeed in inspiring and motivating the next generation of mathematicians and scientists? These are just some of the things we need to discuss and get right if we're to keep developing as the inquisitive, innovative, productive and prosperous nation we want to be. I know the Chief Scientist has been an active contributor to this debate, especially through his report to the Prime Minister, Mathematics, Engineering and Science in the National Interest. Despite a tough budgetary environment, the Government has acted quickly on a number of the report's findings. We have allocated $54 million for a range of measures, including nearly $12 million to improve the quality of training for maths and science teachers in our schools, managed by the Office for Learning and Teaching, to stimulate and encourage the curiosity of students, so more choose to study these subjects at school and go on with them at university, and to champion the great value of maths and science across industry and the education system through the appointment of Rosalind Prinsley as the National Mathematics and Science Education and Industry Advisor. These are important and tangible policies which I know will make a real difference. But as shown by the Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics Country Comparisons, which was recently released by the Australian Council of Learned Academies, although we are doing well, there is no room for complacency. We need to keep stretching our horizons. We need to keep thinking laterally, and we need to keep coming up with bright new ideas and strong policies that make the most of what maths and science offer. Your views are a valuable part of this process, and we want to hear them. Today is an excellent forum to achieve that. I wish you an interesting and stimulating conversation.
Professor Ian Chubb.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be here to continue this discussion. As the Minister said, it's been going on for a little while, but it's pretty important, and it's pretty important that we do something. So I am one of those people who, as my age increases, my tolerance with inaction decreases. And we talk a lot about things. We've talked a lot for a long time about things. But we've got to break the eggs, not to break them, but to cook a good omelette. And we haven't been willing to do that on the scale that we need, with the direction that we need, in order to change things fundamentally. Let me just give you two bits of data which I'll probably garble, but and they're sort of in the back of my mind when I address the 7 points that I've got to address in the 10 minutes remaining. If you look at the proportion of the education employment cohort, 73% of that employment cohort with a postgraduate qualification are over the age of 55. Over the age of 45. 73% of the postgraduate qualifications reside in people who are over the age of 45. And I'm interested in it for a different reason. I'm interested in it what happens when the baby boomers go, and how are we going to replace the qualifications that go with those people. So if you've got 73% of your postgraduate qualifications in education with people aged over 45, what does that actually tell you? It means that there are not people coming along in the pipeline with those sort of skills, that formal qualification level, that will be used to drive some of the changes that we need. And it's about time that we recognised it on the first hand, verified it on the second, and did something about it on the third. So I've got a few points here that I've been asked to comment on, obviously very briefly. The role of science or STEM in future-proofing in Australian and global terms, and the need for long-term overarching strategic vision. Well, in my view, that's what we lack. We have a whole lot of programs. I'm not going to argue that any one of those programs is bad. I haven't seen any that are bad. But I am going to argue that there are a lot of them, and they are administered and run through 14 different portfolios. This is research and science I'm talking about. Whole lot of portfolios, whole lot of programs. And what we actually lack is I think, a cohering strategic approach to how we develop this and the pipeline that comes through to enable it to be sustainable. So if you look, for example, at the proportion of the natural and physical sciences employment cohort, then 57% of that cohort with postgraduate qualifications are aged over 45 years. And when you think about that, you're actually looking at a fair chunk of the present workforce and a workforce that will lose those skills as those people retire from the natural and physical sciences and from education. And we've got a little while to redress the balance, but it will take strategic and focused action. So my long-term overarching strategic vision, which we are preparing in my office as I stand here, we'll try to get to some of those terms and talk about how we need actually to bring the sort of whole together so that we have a comprehensive overview of what we're trying to achieve. We've articulated clearly the purpose for all this. We have to understand the difference between means and ends. A lot of what we talk about are means, but we refer to them as if they are ends. Teaching itself is not an end. It is a means to an end. Research is not an end. It is a means to an end. So once we've clearly identified what the ends are and we can then identify what the means are, we can do a couple of things. And the mantra that runs through even the talk I was giving in Melbourne this morning, the mantra for the moment is alignment to the ends. Let's work out what we want to do. Where do we want science to fit into our community? How do we want our community to understand science? How do we want our community to understand the fact that good and proper science is being done in this country for a purpose which will lead to the betterment of the lives of the people of this country? And it'll do it in two ways. One, because for those of us who live here. And the second is that when it's done well and done properly and is high quality, it will serve well Australia's place in the world. We will have earned a place in the world. We will contribute to the way humanity can improve its lot in life. We will make contributions to the problems that occur with health and food supply and so on around the world. And science is at the core of all of those. But science on its own, as I've written once before, science on its own is very lonely. Science operates in a context, and without that context being understood, then science will be diminished, or its value will be diminished. So in the strategy that we're drafting up as I stand here and speak, we are re-emphasising the need, formally, for a social compact. We define the ends. We say it doesn't matter how good the science is, if society, community doesn't understand it or doesn't want it, then they'll ignore it, or they'll argue against it, like we see on some particular bits, in various media outlets now. The wrong points will be argued because there will be presumptions made. There will be assertions made that don't stand the scrutiny of evidence. But we've got to try to find a way to say, what are we doing it for? And let's work with the community simultaneously, Not say, I've discovered this and this is good for you, so therefore you have to adopt it. But work with them as we walk along that path of discovery, innovation, implementation. How do government and tertiary educators work together on this? Well, and I would put in their employers. One of the problems we have in Australia, in my view, is that a good solid education in science does not necessarily lead to a good solid job outside the science sector. And I think that content is critically important, but I think the process is important. So I said to the group in Melbourne this morning, because the CEO of the ARC was there and I know he's a nuclear physicist, so I used physics to illustrate the point. Physics content is important, but on the other side of the same coin, delivering the content of physics is about inculcating a process. It's about inculcating a method. It's inculcating an understanding of how things work. It's about how evidence is accumulated, drawn out, shredded, tested, put back together, argued, a sceptical approach to what people are telling you. And that is a key element in the process, I believe. So you deliver physics for two reasons. One is because the content is important, and the second is to ensure that the students studying that content understand the processes that is underpinning the whole educational system that they're operating with. And I think government, educators, tertiary educators, secondary and primary educators all have a role to achieve the end, and employers all have a role to achieve the end point. And the end point, surely, is making Australia's better and making Australia's place in the world more secure. So the public contribution to the discussion, critically important in my view. I don't think that we engage them well enough. I think that we have tended over the years, increasingly probably, as things get more competitive on the one hand, more obstreperous on the other, we've tended to take some stuff for granted. And I don't think that we should be doing that. I think that we should be making sure that we take the public with us and explain why we are doing something, what we're actually doing, why we are doing it, how we are doing it, and what the pros and the cons are. Tony Blair, famous Prime Minister of another country, ex-Prime Minister of another country, gave a speech to the Royal Society in 2002, and he made he said a couple of sentences that stuck in my mind. He said, "Science provides the context within which we can choose to do more, Well, clearly I'm paraphrasing. Within which we could choose to do more. But science doesn't tell us whether doing more is right or wrong. And I think that is a really critical, I mean, the scales fell off my eyes when I saw this brilliantly written pair of sentences, because it's what I've been labouring over for a long time. How do you explain it? That it doesn't tell you whether doing more is right or wrong, but it gives you the choice of doing more if you think it's right. And so we as a scientific community, we as an educated community have to get out there and say to people, how are we going to resolve some of these issues? How are we going to solve some of these problems? What will we do about it? How will we present to you both the positives and the negatives? These things seem to me to be quite important and quite a significant thing for us as educators to do. So I think the contribution of science to the future of this country and how we future-proof Australia in global and Australian terms will have understood science, science that is compatible with human hopes and aspirations at its core. I can't think of too many of the big problems that confront humanity that don't have science at their core, but I can't think of any that are uniquely science. They require the humanities, the social sciences, they require all of these disciplines to actually work and come together in a different way from any way we've done it before. We need to get employers to come together in a different way from the way we've got it before. So we need to change the way we think, we need to change how we think, we need to change the way we educate, and we need to change, as a consequence of that, the way we prepare people to educate. So as one person, I'm just preoccupied with watching the tweets about my performance as I sit here. This is quite unusual. It's a bit like being in the gymnastics competition in the Olympic Games. But it is true that we too often treat students simply as a mechanism to bring income into the institution and not as a partner in an educational process. Thank you.
I was going to say, if we can keep you here for a couple of minutes, we can probably just have a couple of questions now, if anyone has something burning they want to ask. No one at this stage? Actually, I've got a quick question. Is what do you think is the main driver for fewer PhD graduates in recent years? And you take the microphone.
Well, there are more. Comprehensive across the board, there are more. The government has increased the number of PhD scholarships and indeed the funding support for PhD students quite substantially. The issue with a lot of it is that in the democracy that we live in, students exercise their right to choose. So they might choose disciplines that I wouldn't, for example. And indeed, in some instances, they choose in large numbers to numbers that are too large to go into some disciplines that I wouldn't. That's another matter. So the question is, no, but there will be some of them in this room. But I guess the main point is, how do you bring about a sort of series of incentives once you've decided what's important and critically important? Once we've decided that we do or don't understand the pipeline, or the pipeline is so poor that it's not going to lead to a sustainable outcome, that we've got to do something about the front end of the pipeline. Sorry, undergraduate students, graduate students and so on. And then I think that it's time for us to say that you can't just leave this to the exclusively to what people are choosing to do or what they want to do. You've got to try to intervene in that process, not stopping them choosing what they want to do, but you can try to entice them into some areas that are critically important. So I would be into enticement. I would be into making sure that we had enough agricultural scientists coming through our pipelines in this country. You know, I've used the figure often, but there were 4,200 jobs advertised that needed agricultural science and 700 graduates. Well, can we afford to let that happen just because we have a process that we invented 30 years ago and we run with a few fiddles at the margins? I don't think we can.
Any questions? Yes. Can we get a microphone to you? I mean, I can. Just hold on 1 second. Why don't I? Here you go. Have mine.
Professor Chubb, my name's Angela Colliver and I'm representing the Association for Environmental Education. But like our chair, my most recent appointment was with higher education. You mentioned the plethora of programs delivered by perhaps a disconnect of portfolios. There is a lot of Mickey Mouse science out there in those programs, and there is a lot of high quality science. Is there any anticipation for a review of that plethora of programs so that we can strategically perhaps look at what's working well, what's been there historically forever and more, and then look to, I guess, the future using 21st century methodologies and the outcomes that your strategy and paper are working towards to really achieve some of the outcomes you articulated?
Well, I think that if you're going to have a strategy and there's a whole lot of programs already in place, then it becomes almost inevitable that you do have a look at those programs and make sure that they're cohering around a sort of shared purpose, which might be, I don't know, if I take one example I'll get into trouble, so I won't. But I do think it's part of a process where if we can be much more strategic about it, then we do two things. We develop a process which we haven't had before in a serious way. Of course we've had them, but they've been sort of itty-bitty. And the second thing is we make decisions in ways that we haven't before. So when the government adopted the strategic research priorities which were announced last Friday, the reason that we did it the way we did was to say, well, what is the end game here? So one of them, for example, is living with a changing environment. We wrote it living with a changing environment because it allows for work done in physics, chemistry, biology, humanities, social sciences, the natural environment and the constructed environment. And then we need to make sure how we're supporting those areas, and then we need to make sure that we know what we're supporting. So I couldn't possibly comment on Mickey Mouse science, but But I could say that I think as part of a process, we ought to be making sure we're focusing on high quality science in a focused way that gives us a scale of operation that will be large enough, appropriately large enough, different across the areas, but appropriately large enough to make a difference.
Okay, look, we better move on for that, but thank you very much, Professor Chubb. You take a seat up here if you like. Yeah, that would be wonderful. All right, well, look, let's now move through our panel here. So first up, we have Professor Merlin Crosley, Boosting the Status of Science Teaching. You can stay there if you like, talk from there. I think it should be on. Do we have microphones on?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Thanks, Graham. So look, we do have a shortage of good maths and science teachers. It's not a new issue. Some people think that this crisis is so very old that it should go into the too hard basket, with old chestnuts like the fast train to Canberra, Sydney's second airport, the new flag and the Republic, things which have been talked about all my life and I'm not that young. But the science teaching problem, I think, is easier. We don't have to build a whole railway all the way to Canberra. If we can lay down some tracks in the right direction, if we can do anything, that could help. I want to get more inspirational science people into science teaching. So how do we make the career of science teaching more attractive? Perhaps I can contribute by saying how universities make jobs attractive, and it's not rocket science. I'll just run through 4 points and then I'll suggest a concrete proposal that relies on them. First point is community. We have good communities at universities, but they would be even better if we engaged more with high schools. We don't have teachers, high school teachers, talking today because the Conversation's a newspaper where journalists work with university academics and the OLT's focused on universities primarily. I'm sure teachers have their own forums too. It would be great to have a combined forum, and anything we do to increase the links between schools and universities will boost both communities. That's the first point. The second point is status. I hate that snobby word, but at universities, status is hugely important. Surely the teaching profession could also benefit from a boost. The status of teaching is now in danger because the entry cutoffs for teaching degrees are falling like never before. We have to stop that. The New South Wales Minister for Education, Adrian Piccoli, has argued for increasing the cutoffs, and I think we should insist on high entry standards for high school students going into teaching degrees, provided that alternative routes are open for students who are late developers. Boosting cutoffs really does attract higher quality students. In universities, we've set high cutoffs for advanced science and advanced maths degrees, and this has attracted very strong students, among other things. I wish status didn't matter in society, but status does matter. Third thing is salary. If we raise the cutoffs for entry into teaching degrees, as I think we should, we will create an even greater shortage of teachers, so we'll have to do something drastic. Wherever there is a drastic shortage, one generally boosts salaries. This happens in universities already. We pay more in business, law, and medicine, where market forces create a shortage. And it doesn't destroy collegiality at universities. And then finally, promotions. In universities, we have elaborate promotion systems that rival those of the military, the church, or the police force. We have lecturer, senior lecturer, professor, dean, vice-chancellor, and at the very top of the pile, we have Australian Research Council Laureate Research Fellow. And I'm serious, ARC Laureate Fellows, they're at the top of the tree, and it was a controversial scheme when it started as the Federation Fellowship Scheme, but the top researchers were paid twice as much as regular professors, and I think it's worked. The whole sector is stronger. The systems we have for reward are not perfect, but there are few surprises. The rewards boost productivity, and for many, they also boost job satisfaction. I support the ideas I've heard about extending promotion systems in high schools. So now for a concrete proposal. It's in part inspired by an article that Darren Soares, to my left, and colleagues wrote in The Conversation. It borrows on ideas from CSIRO's Brilliant Scientists in Schools program, and from Melbourne Uni's excellent Teach for Australian initiative, and from the New Australian Science and Maths Partnership grants. There is lots of great things that are happening already. So how about this? Let's introduce a national high school postdoctoral fellowship scheme where PhD graduates are paid attractive salaries to complete 2-year part-time education diplomas while working as trainee teachers, each with a high school and a university mentor to link both communities. That's it. It's that simple. Obviously, not all PhD graduates will make good researchers. Not all will even make good scientists. Nor am I saying you need a PhD to teach. But if in 2 years' time Australia had more PhD graduates in our classrooms, I think that would send a very powerful message. So to conclude, this fellowship scheme could be a boost for the teaching profession. The mentoring links could enhance the community. Having more PhDs could enhance the prestige and status of the profession. Having a PhD could justify higher salaries, and I hope ultimately teaching will be so highly respected that all teachers are valued more by society. Most importantly, the fellowships would provide a new pool of highly talented scientists to alleviate the shortage of teachers. A national teaching postdoctoral fellowship scheme might not be perfect at first, but I'm sure the Chief Scientist is smart enough to perfect it. We won't have built a fast train to Canberra, but hopefully we will have laid down some solid steel rails in the right direction, rather than just endlessly talking and dreaming like a bunch of useless sleepers. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Crosley. Jennifer Donovan is going to talk about searching for scientific Mozarts.
Got me? I hope, yeah. Thank you very much. Well, Merlin just offered you a short-term solution to get our teachers in a hurry. I'm looking at a much longer-term solution. And I'm going to begin and make my first point through some words that I finished my PhD thesis off with relatively recently. And they'll be familiar to at least one person in the room. Every day, we hear stories about climate change, cloning, genetically modified food, space exploration, DNA, and new drugs, to name a few. We need a community that can evaluate these claims and determine for themselves how they will respond and behave when given options. To make any choice at all, especially one that is near rational, you need information and a base level of knowledge to help understand that information. In this climate, the value of science needs to be protected from being manipulated by politics, misinterpreted in the media, and from being dulled down in our schools. To do this, we need an inspired Australia, a national culture that appreciates the role science plays in every aspect of our lives, from our health to our economy. And those words were by Professor Ian Chubb at his Inspiring Australia's Scientific Culture speech down the road at the CSIRO, March 13, 2012. So my first point is, we need a scientifically literate population. My second point is that we know that students in science are declining. And that's a rather grim picture. My third point is the fact that research shows that children are most interested in science when they are 10 years old. And I know from my own research, I've been in schools where I've been talking about genes and DNA to year 5s, which are 10 years old, and I've been followed out to the car park by kids still asking me more and more and more questions, despite their mother's best efforts to prize them away and say, you know, do leave that nice lady alone, dear, we've got to go and pick up your brother. Kids are fascinated by science at that age. Their career aspirations are pretty much sorted out by the time they're 13 and 14. I was just reading a journal on the way down in the plane, and they said that successful scientists all got their passion for science when they were very young in primary school. Yet what are we doing in primary school? We are not teaching robust science. And so that's what we were talking about, searching for scientific Mozarts. We need to be immersing our young children in science so that they catch that interest and they keep it, almost dare I say, and I'm an ex-high school teacher, despite the best efforts of teachers to get it out of them. Because we notice that that interest declines when they get to high school. Instead of being built up by science, they lose it. So children have a lot of interest in science. They ask fabulous questions, you know, what, where, how, when, and why. They are all great scientific questions, and they ask them ad nauseum when they're very young. And perhaps it's because adults get fed up with answering them that that spark of interest dies. children also have a great capacity for language, and science is very much like a foreign language. And you only have to look at a little one that trots out Tyrannosaurus Rex to know that they have a great capacity for learning the language of science when they're younger. And we know that because of brain plasticity changes, that diminishes as we get older. So surely we should be getting science into them at that time when they are most capable of learning and absorbing. Now, we also know that children today are exposed to very different ideas from children in the past. We have the media, and they are heavily exposed to science in the media. And I think it's important that we hear some voices of children here today. So I'm going to read you just a few quotes. Everyone's DNA, apart from your family, is different. DNA is in blood and fingerprints. It circulates through your body. Also, DNA, if you've touched a glass, they can look at your fingerprints and say who it was. On bones, they use fingerprints to tell who that person is if they don't know. How old do you think that child is? She's in year 5. She's 10. Let's have a look at another one. If someone broke into a car, you can put special powder over it. It shows up the fingerprints, and then you get the DNA. I know, because my auntie's car was fingerprinted, and I've seen it before on CSI. Joel, year 5. DNA has to do with blood types and fingerprints. It helps to identify us. It can find out criminals and relatives. I learned about DNA on Law and Order in Cold Case. That's a runter, an Indigenous child, year 5. And I can't go without leaving you with Willis, year 6. Also, if there's a criminal, a crime scene, a tiny hair follicle can be looked at under the microscope and they can find all the DNA. For crimes, if you left your hat, there's pretty much a 99% chance there's going to be like hair or skin cells or sweat they can use to find the DNA. And then, if it's a criminal who did it, they'll probably log it into the computer. And then the computer will come up with all these subjects, and the DNA will give you maybe 1 or 2 people who might have a direct match. Now, you can tell where at least 3 of the children got their information from. They told you. Willis, on the other hand, was a bit of a special case. All that fantastic information. Willis was one of 27% of the students in my sample who had researched DNA and genes for himself. And my sample was restricted to years 5 to 7, kids 10 to 12, that vital age when they are excited and interested. So, they're surrounded by the media, they're picking up information from the entertainment mass media, they're getting inspired to do their research. What are we doing about that? Sadly, not a lot. Now, I know the political reasons why the curriculum is the way it is, but I really feel we've missed the boat in terms of getting robust ideas of big ideas of science into those early years. And we're about to start some research with a very talented teacher who is teaching atomic theory to young children. And the class we're going to be researching with are year 4. He claims that he's had success. We are hoping through research to verify whether that really is successful and whether those children are really going to learn atomic theory at year 4. Over in Perth, David Blair is also researching, and he's even teaching Einstein's theory to young kids, and he's finding, in fact, they're way more receptive than when they're older and they've been sort of Newtonized. They're much more interested in Einstein when they're younger. So this is what I'm saying. We need to get good, robust science into our primary children, catch that interest, fan the flame, and I think Australia will benefit in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was going to say, that's something I've noticed. Actually, I give a few talks to schools, and you give talks to primary schools, and the kids have all got their hands up. And I've talked through some fairly sort of sophisticated astrophysics concepts, but they're all interested, all want to know about it in primary school. Secondary school, there's not that same level of interest, but yeah, very interesting. I thank you very much. And Dr. Darren Soares, if you could talk next, please.
Thanks, Graham. I'm in a little bit of a difficult situation. In some ways, Merlin's stolen a lot of my thunder with his fantastic little talk there, but I think I've got a slightly different angle that maybe we can explore later. And while I would never ever claim to be a scientific Mozart, the fact that I'm sitting here is a direct result of the sort of environment you're talking about. I had friends of family and teachers who were all active researchers, and I've no doubt that's why I'm a researcher today. So I sit here I'm going to present a very, very simple idea. We wrote this article as representatives of the early and mid-career researcher forum of the Academy of Science. So we're representing basically new PhD graduates and people who've been working actively in research for around about 10 to 15 years, or up to 10 to 15 years. So in some ways, Ian, we're at the opposite end of that demographic problem that you pointed out. And the simple idea is this, is that we represent a huge pool of passionate, motivated, well-trained people We sit at a point where by the time we get to the end of our PhDs, a research career is not necessarily as attractive as it was when we started our PhDs. And our argument is essentially that this pool of people should be grabbed hold of by education, and not everybody, obviously some people are going to be more attracted to it than others, but we should provide a means and try and find ways to attract some part of this huge pool of people into teaching, and that would be a win for the students, it would be a win for science education in general, and it would also be a nice outcome for these people that are highly trained and motivated. There are obvious challenges around this, and maybe in question time we can delve into some of these. And I guess our kind of bent on this and talking to the people that are in this position of being recently graduated from a PhD, Merlin's idea is a fantastic one, and certainly in gaining feedback from people I know with PhDs that are teachers, and from researchers and from teachers, one of the key things that keeps coming back to us all the time is a need to diversify our PhD training. So at the moment, most people in Australia do a research PhD, and certainly in science and technology studies anyway, do a research PhD that is basically set up to pump out researchers. And when you get to the end of that track and you look 10 years after graduation, very few people are actually still working as active researchers. So we're not actually training people for where they end up. And so the argument that we would like to put forward is that we need to diversify PhD training. We need to provide avenues within that training framework for experience outside pure research, whether it's teaching or whether it's in industry, and that we need to work with people like Merlin to develop this kind of idea. And I'm not discounting your idea, because I think that's also a fantastic one, but I think in terms of a slightly longer term view, I think that would have huge benefits. And really I'm going to leave it at that, because I don't think that's something we can discuss later.
Thank you very much. We now have Dr. Rachel Grieve, Why Scientists' Skills Need to Spread.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be on the discussion today. I just want to start off with a little bit of an interesting fact for you, and that interesting fact is the fact that when ice cream consumption goes up, so do shark attacks at the beach, which is, a fairly interesting fact. And I just want to sort of reflect on that for a little bit and think, well, is this because people see the shark attacks on the news and they get a bit upset and they, pull out a little thing of ice cream to make themselves feel a little bit better? That might be the case. Or is it perhaps the fact that the sharks really like people who eat ice cream? Maybe they taste a little bit better. Now, I'm happy to report that none of those things are actually true. What I've actually just mentioned to you is something which is an example of what we call a third variable problem, where there's a third variable that actually explains the relationship I've just talked about. There's not actually a direct relationship between ice cream consumption and shark attacks at the beach. What it actually is it's about hot weather. And in hot weather, more people eat ice cream, and in hot weather, more people go and swim at the beach. And these are some of the issues which actually makes it look like there's a connection there that there's not. As I said, that's a third variable problem. There's lots of these kinds of things in the literature. One of my personal favourites is the fact that the number of churches in a city is actually positively correlated with the number of bars. You can make of that what you will, but I'm hoping that, with a moment's reflection, you'll stop and think about the fact that, well, what is the actual explanation for that? And it's the fact that with an increased population, there are more of all facilities, and it's not that people are heading straight to the pub after they've been to church. So I've sort of been very light-hearted with those kinds of comments there. I'm going to make another comment now, and I would just like you to think about this one in the same kind of context. Autism rates have increased with immunisation rates. And all of a sudden, a fact starts to get a lot more serious. And a statement like that will lead to responses on blogs along the lines of, oh, well, autism was unheard of before vaccination, or I know a child who became autistic after having their vaccine. And it's these comments which really highlight why scientists' skills need to spread beyond the scientific community and out into the broader population. When I say scientific thinking skills, though, it's probably a good time to sort of stop and reflect about what I'm actually talking about with that. So we talk about scientific thinking, we talk about critical thinking, but what are those actual things? When we talk about critical thinking, there's actually no one real definition of what critical thinking actually is. But the kinds of critical thinking that we might see is when somebody's asking questions like, well, why is that the case? Are there any other alternative explanations that might explain what it is that we've seen? And in the case of the vaccine versus autism issue that I've just thought about and just raised for you there, the kinds of critical thinking that we might see there would be something like, well, what are the alternative explanations? And perhaps it's something to do with the fact that diagnostic criteria have changed for autism over time. Or perhaps we could think about it in terms of critical thinking. We're thinking, well, what's the difference between anecdotal evidence and scientific evidence? Where is it that the weight should actually be? Which leads me again onto the next point, which is about why scientists are so important. So those kinds of thinking skills are what scientists engage in every single day. And I know that many of the people who are sitting in this room and who are sitting at this table do this all the time. So the information is out there, you gather the information, you evaluate it, you might generate some ideas, you'll test some hypotheses, and then you'll try and make some conclusions. Now, sometimes in science, we don't actually make conclusions at all. Sometimes we have an answer that actually just leads to more questions, or we don't get an answer at all. But that's okay in science. We're actually happy with ambiguity. We're happy for people to not necessarily have a really clear answer. And we're also happy to say, you know what, I don't know, but I'm still trying to figure it out. And that ambiguity is really important. But what is really important about this is that scientists use these skills every day in order to be able to evaluate and integrate information and then hopefully make good decisions based on that. But scientists aren't the only people who need to make decisions. People in every walk of life need to make important decisions too. So surely being able to integrate and evaluate information to help make those decisions is a skill that everybody should have access to. I'd like to just maybe think about or present a couple of ideas about how this could actually make a difference in a few day-to-day scenarios for people. So imagine a person sitting at the chemist and they're thinking about buying a dietary supplement. Would they make a different purchase if they understood things like the placebo effect? We can look at data from a handful of people, and we know that it's better to get data from 1,000 people. But how many people know that getting data from 10,000 people might not be all that more helpful than the 1,000 people, and it might make something seem to be important when it's actually not? We can talk about the fact that we're just humans. What we tend to do is we tend to ignore base rates, and what we'll do is rely on how much something springs to mind in order to make a decision, or we'll rely on stereotypes. For policymakers, they might like to think about the fact of whether or not, when we're talking about donating organs, whether or not a question asks you to opt in or opt out of organ donation. That makes a big difference. If a question's posed to you in a positive way rather than in a negative way, your response is likely to be quite different, even though it's the same question. A business person being able to evaluate ideas and integrate them together might be able to come up with some very profitable innovations. And a parent sitting across from a doctor in a doctor's surgery trying to make decisions about their child's future would be really benefiting from having a good idea about what risk and probability really mean. So to me, scientific thinking isn't just about science, it's actually about life. And in 2013, this ability to be a critical consumer of information is more important than ever. And this is because information is everywhere. We can look up things on our smartphones, on our tablets, we can look up things on our laptops, we can do it anywhere and anytime, and we can look it up on any topic that we like. And the problem is that now that information is written by anyone. We really need to be able to actually stop and have a look at the quality of the information. We need to have those skills. We need to train people to have those skills in order to be able to be critical consumers of the literature. So whether or not you're a professional, a policymaker, or a person on the street, being able to make those decisions can be really important. So it seems that scientific thinking actually could have some really positive and significant results and could contribute much more to a positive scientific culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think for those of us who have been through that scientific training, I don't know about for you, but for me, that was a big moment where you sort of thought, oh, this is going to happen for sure. And then you do the experiment the other day and think, wait a minute, that doesn't happen. I find that hard to believe. It's kind of a big moment where you kind of don't jump to the conclusion. And I think it's easy to take that for granted that's actually something you learn in science that often you don't learn as with such a hard way out in a non-scientific career. Thank you very much, and our last speaker on the panel, anyway, is Dr. Chris Tisdell, who's going to talk about online and mobile learning in maths and science education.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming, thanks for having me, and thanks for tuning in on the live feed. So I wanted to start my talk today by asking a couple of questions to the audience. Think back to high school. What was your worst memory of mathematics? And what was your best memory of mathematics? Now, did the answer to the first question come a bit faster than the answer to the second question? Well, those who answered my teacher to the first question that I posed will not be surprised to learn that there's a huge shortage of qualified and engaging maths teachers across Australia. And this is for a number of reasons. But to combat this, the Office of Learning and Teaching and the Office of the Chief Scientist have been very, very carefully considering what to do and launch some schemes. And it's very clear that they've been thinking very hard about it. And in fact, we think these schemes are great. Merlin and I have actually got a bid in on the current round. And the idea is to make the teachers better, okay? Improve the supply and the quality of teachers. Now, I'm going to talk about the problem from another end, one that lies, I guess an angle that lies beyond the classroom. Now, the future of education, in my opinion, will be online, on demand and mobile. And driving these trends will be the NBN, the National Broadband Network, and Australia's love affair with the mobile phone. So, for example, Australia has the second highest penetration of smartphones in the world, just behind Singapore. Now, the angle that I'm going to talk about is empowering the learner rather than empowering the teachers. Okay, for me, it's a two-way. You attack the problem from two angles to improve education. Now, you may have heard of open educational resources and massively open online courses, OER and MOOCs. These terms have popped up in the last few years. They're online platforms that offer millions of people unprecedented access to education. Examples of platforms are YouTube EDU, Academic Earth, edX, Coursera. There's a whole lot of them. Now, the flexibility and the popularity of these modern and future-looking learning platforms positions them very well to be significant factors in the future of education. Now, in fact, I've been playing in the OER field myself, and in 2008 I started creating YouTube videos to help my students at UNSW get access to out-of-class learning. Okay, so I've been doing it for 5 years. Last year I wrote a free textbook aimed at engineering students studying mathematics. The impact and the reach of these initiatives have been vast, and I would claim very positive. So, for example, I've had millions of hits on YouTube from within Australia and around the world. 500,000 people have downloaded my textbook, and the response. Every year we survey UNSW students, and over 3 years at UNSW, 100% of respondents agreed with the statement, "I found the YouTube videos to be a valuable learning resource." So, if we take the crisis in mathematics education and we couple it with the new mathematics curriculum that's about to get rolled out, then is the answer building more open educational resources, or perhaps MOOCs, that empower the learners and are linked closely to the national curriculum in mathematics? Now, such a platform could complement face-to-face teaching by providing the students with out-of-class support. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to replace teaching, it complements it. Now, I would also claim that there's 3 aspects to any sort of platform. One would be painting the big picture, sort of like an edutainment style, high quality productions that paint a big picture and motivate the study of subjects through applications. The second would be summarising the content. And the third would be providing assessment tools that offer more than just mindless calculations. So for me, it's a 3-step approach. It's far too convenient to solely blame teachers for the crisis in mathematics education. Yes, let's enhance classical face-to-face mathematics teaching, but to provide a holistic approach to investing in Australia for a smarter future, we need to think beyond the classroom.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I've seen some of your YouTube videos, very good, I thought, actually, and I can kind of imagine they're the sort of thing. I mean, often you see students, they go to a lecturer and they say, oh, my lecturer didn't really explain this, but I didn't get that bit, and they get the lecture notes from another lecturer. It's kind of filling that gap, I suspect. You can then go and look at the online resource and catch up on those things you might have missed, or, you know, because in a face-to-face lecture, you've only got to sort of vague out for a little while and you can miss something. I imagine it's a really useful resource.
Well, I guess also, Graham, I should say that mine are very, very amateur. They're totally unsophisticated. It's more like reality TV than Hollywood. So,
I will get you up to Catalyst standards soon, I'm sure. All right, look, and if I could finally invite maybe up to the lectern here to get the student's point of view, which seems sort of fairly relevant in this whole thing. This is Jade Trul to speak on the student's point of view. Thank you.
Now, I have a confession to make. I'm not actually a science or a maths student myself, but I have been talking to a lot of students about this issue ever since I came across the fact that I would be speaking today. So I really have a lot of great perspectives to offer, and I think the discussion has really been, I agree with a lot of what's been said about the need to change the way we've framed maths and science as it is at the moment anyway, because obviously, as Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So we really need to start reacting to the students and reacting to their needs and wants, and also acknowledging the changing environment that young people live in, where they have so many stimuli in their environment, and they really need to ensure that curiosity is retained. So I really like what was discussed before about this curiosity that exists when we're young, from from a very young age till about, I would say, about 12 years old, and then you've got to be all cool and start to think about your image, and then for some reason that curiosity gets lost there, and it's important to foster that curiosity into the future and really start early, a love of maths and a love of science and learning. So essentially, from the student perspective, it's so important to keep maths and science dynamic and interesting, and not only in university, because by the time students are in university, they either love science or they don't. They've made that decision to go with that course, and often the students that I've spoken to anyway have talked about a love of science or maths from a very early age, and that's why they've chosen their course. So it's really early that we have to tackle this love and foster this. And also, a big issue that has to be tackled is a realisation of a student's capabilities from very early on. I think a huge barrier to participation in maths or science is actually a lack of understanding of perhaps one or two key concepts that really create a lack of love or no love for maths or science that really holds a student back. So the different levels of capability really need to be recognised in our teaching, especially for low SES students, Indigenous students, to make sure that they're really participating in university science and maths courses. So, say for example, missing one or two classes, I think that was a really good point that was made before. If a student misses one or two classes and they really can't catch up, they will stop being engaged, and that really can actually make the difference between loving science or maths and not loving science or maths. So mentoring from an early age as well, and a realisation of different capabilities needs to be integrated into different courses from primary school through high school and into university as well. And I think a really big point that has to be made is that problem solving and its application to real life scenarios needs to be recognised in a more comprehensive way, especially at university. The feedback that I've been getting from students is that students really need, I'll actually read out this quote, it's quite a good one. I think science education could be improved if there was a greater opportunity for students to solve problems as part of a project-based course structure, as opposed to arbitrarily going through the motions of learning facts and reproducing traditional solutions. It could also provide students with a more intuitive understanding and a sense of ownership over their knowledge that they've obtained throughout their course. I think the way science is currently being taught teaches the majority of students how to absorb facts and plug values into equations, but not necessarily how to argue their case or how to solve problems with a novel approach. I think that's a really important thing to note. And obviously, when we're talking about the benefits of a science or maths education, students really need to understand that core value, those skills that they learn, those life skills, those analytical skills from a very early age, that's what they can benefit from. Another thing that has been raised with me is that the literacy of science and maths really needs to be appreciated, that seeking the truth and backing it up with evidence that you can obtain, whether it's finding an answer or not. I think that problem solving and those skills really need to be emphasised through a love of passion for discovery, essentially. Because as young students and young people, who wouldn't love Questacon? I think creating a classroom that's more like Questacon from an early age would actually benefit a lot of students and foster a love of understanding of science and maths. So for some reason, that divide there, somewhere along the line, probably from just the puberty age, I guess, we need to plug that gap where curiosity is lost. So another thing just to raise briefly is that at a university level, teaching really needs to be research inspired, not just teachers that are also researchers, but really research inspired teaching. So it needs to be integrated into the classroom. I'm sure students would actually love to know the research that their teachers are currently engaging in. I think it would provide a really unique experience as well. So I know that's something that they're really hungry for. And these are obviously the students that are already in love with science or maths, so they really need to be reaching their full potential through that research that their teachers are engaging in. And I'd like to make one last point, I think, and then I'll leave it there. My understanding, it's quite a crude understanding, but science diplomacy is obviously used at an international level in order to solve problems and to come to solutions for nations, but why don't we use science diplomacy more successfully at a local level? Why don't we use it in our primary schools, in our high schools, to actually explain concepts and explain how we can solve problems through a love of science and that real curiosity that we can foster. So that understanding of science from that problem-solving angle really needs to be nurtured a bit more through those early ages and up through university as well. So I guess I wanted to respond a bit to what Professor Chubb was saying before about a means to an end. Obviously, teaching is a means, but in terms of an end, I think that end could be the retention of curiosity. So keep curiosity alive. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jade. Yeah, I wonder if the demise of the chemistry set has sort of killed off kids' curiosity a bit. I mean, that's how I got into science. In fact, I didn't have a chemistry set. I used to get my chemicals from Selby's, the chemical supplier, at age 8. I'd ring up, order whatever I liked, the truck would turn up, I'd go out there and get it and pay for it, which, of course, these days you couldn't have the kind of garage lab that I had back in my day. But anyway, I guess we do have to consider safety. Well, look, now it's time for questions from you guys on the floor, and out there in the wider world, send in your questions via Twitter. Who has questions? Go right in the front here. We'll get a microphone to you, yes?
Hello, Carol Hoysley, University of Southern Queensland. A number of the speakers have indicated invoking using PhDs and teacher training. We've also heard from Jenny, who I'm working with, that young children are very interested in science. And as a scientist who's teaching science education to primary teachers who generally dislike science enormously, do any of the speakers have a proposal about improving the quality of science in primary schools, perhaps by using PhD students?
Okay, do we have a volunteer for that question? So the question's a pretty broad one, I guess, is in how do we improve science teaching in primary schools? It's not working, I don't think. We'll get you another one. Yeah. What's up? No, I think that's on. Hello. Do we have a microphone? Try one more. Third time lucky.
Well, hello. Right. So now that I know I've got your attention, I was going to say two things that relate in a little way to that question at least. One is that according to the data we've got, 3% of teaching time in primary schools is spent on science. Now, I know that there will be science embedded in some other bits of the learning week, but if the students don't see it as science, then why would they think it's science? They might think it's a bit about, why plants grow in that particular way or in that particular place or something. But if it's not explained as science, and I think importantly the methods of science, so it seems to me to be critically important at that very early age to be ensuring that people begin to think in terms of how science works as well as what they're seeing. So in many places I've always talked about how science ought to be taught much more like it's practiced. And teachers say they don't have the time to do that. The curriculum or the syllabus is crowded. There's a skills issue and a support issue for the teachers who are trying to do it. There's a difficulty with occupational health and safety, so you can't even buy in a school lab the stuff you could once buy in your garage or for your garage. The technical support behind teachers who want to do interesting things is not what it used to be. So there's a whole collection of decisions that have been taken at different times for different reasons, no doubt. And any one of them could be looked at in isolation and thought to be not bad, but collectively, cumulatively, they've made a serious difference. So the students would tell me that it's, too didactic, it's boring, it's, learning the first 20 elements of the periodic table, but not why you might need to know them, but, this is what you've got to do. And presumably if you remember 10.1 of them, then you pass. So it's a sort of, there's a busyness around which is not allowing time for reflection, consideration, the things that scientists do. You do an experiment, you don't rush out and do another one before you think about the one you've just completed. You sit back, you reflect, you organise, you work out what you need to do. So I think there are issues like serious in-service support for teachers that I think in this country is lacking comprehensively. Of course, there are pockets of good things being done, as Merlin was saying earlier. You can find all of this in there, but bringing it all together in a coherent way is, I think, one of the things we've got to do. And one little anecdote: I launched one of the academy programs in a primary school in the ACT, and it was in Year 5, and this young man had produced with polystyrene balls a scale model of the solar system, approximate scale model, and he was really pleased with it, and he knew what the planets were and how they went round the sun and what went round what, and even for some of them how long they took. And as he was holding it up, it fell apart in front of the entire school. So he didn't flinch. He just picked it up and put it all back together again. And I was launching it after he spoke, and as I walked up, I said, "Oh, it was a pity it fell apart. Oh, it didn't matter," he said. And with the timing that surpassed Jerry Seinfeld, he said, "I learned a lot when I did this, but so did my teacher."
Okay, look, we have a question here on Twitter from Fiona McPhee for Jennifer. Is there an issue about students not going into science because of a lack of perceived employment opportunities at the other end?
I'm not sure that's a factor at primary school. I don't think kids are too busy thinking about employment at that point in time. I certainly think that from my much more remote past as a high school teacher, yes, I think that was certainly part of the case. And certainly it wasn't even so much a lack of employment, I hate to say it was how much money they would earn. And so your best and brightest, even though they were quite brilliant at science, said, doctor, vet or architect, which shall I be? And I said, what's your vocation? What are you passionate about, what you want to do? And some of them said, well, actually, I'd really like to do science, but there's no money in that. And so no, I better go into one of the others, or maybe then medicine or vet because that's closer to science. And I think that's a very sad indictment when we need scientists. And we need scientists at all levels. We need those geniuses, we need the Mozarts, but we need the rank and file scientists too, a lot of them.
I reckon that a lot of people who make career decisions based on those kind of choices might be in for a nasty surprise ultimately when they get out there and do that profession for the rest of their lives.
I tried to warn them, but they didn't listen.
I guess money's a powerful motivator. Okay, questions here. Yeah, at the end here. We'll get a microphone to you first, one that works, I'm sure.
I'm just curious why it's so easy, Chris, to blame teachers. I would have thought you said it's too easy to blame teachers for the crisis in maths and science teaching.
Yes.
Wouldn't it be easier to blame maths and mathematicians and scientists? So, yeah. Sorry, I'm just making the point. There seems to be an assumption that this is an issue about the quality of teaching and not broader issues to do with competitive job opportunities, the ways that mathematicians and scientists communicate the work that they do, the incentives that employers provide for educators. I'm a dean of an education and science faculty, so I've been dealing with this for a long time, and I do think that there are problems, but I think the issue is a lot more complex than just providing an incentive for a teacher or additional teaching resources. I really do think it's got a lot to do with the aspirations of young people in schools. I think it's got even a lot more to do with the fact that you don't need to do maths and science in school anymore in order to get to university. So I think there are lots of issues, but I'm just responding when you said it's too easy to blame teachers. I'm actually agreeing with you. I think it is too easy to blame teachers.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a host of issues that contribute to these factors. On a personal level, I think the universities that take away universities that take away that take away microphones. No. University when universities stop having prerequisites, I think that does concern me, because ultimately I'm going to have to teach those students, and it's personally I don't agree with that. So yes, that's a concern.
Okay, we'll maybe move on the.
Graham, can I just add something
Yeah,
to that?
sorry, yeah.
I think that's a really good point, but I think I don't know how we do this, but I think we need to move away from the notion of science as a vocation more into being literate in science makes you a good citizen. And I think that's probably what you're getting at. And I'm not sure how we impress that on kids, but I think that's a really important point.
I'll just chime in very quickly here too, and I agree with that. We need scientifically literate people as well as we need scientists. But can we also think about the way science is portrayed in the media? You've got the archetypal mad scientist, and if you ask kids to draw a scientist, they draw the sort of Professor Julius Sumner Miller type, with the wild hair and the glasses and the lab coat and the whole thing. And that has been robust for an awful lot of years. Or you've got the Doctor Who type mad scientist, There's not too many positive real attributions of scientists out there in the entertainment media that kids are going to catch on to and go, yeah, I want to be like him. Now, Catalyst, I think, is a great show, and I was very grateful to see that
a number of my comments about me.
A number of my sample children said that they watch Catalyst, which for 10 to 12-year-olds I thought was pretty great. But it's one of the very few positive images of science out there, and maybe that's something we need to think about too.
Interesting point. I'll let Jade have her 2 cents worth here. We'll get a microphone here. The only microphone that works.
Just on that topic of how science is portrayed in the media, I'm actually, one of my degrees is journalism, so I wanted to play the devil's advocate and say, do you think perhaps partly that's due to the fact that some scientists can't sort of get that nutshell sort of 10-second grab out there, because it's often very hard to sum things up in 10 seconds?
Indeed, and that picks up on the the very last of the articles, I think, or close to that, which said we need science education for scientists in order to be able to communicate better, and we need science education for journalists in order to be able to portray what the scientists said better. And I think that's very true too. And so we need, you know, certainly in the news, people, for scientists to be able to put themselves across better. But younger children are not so influenced by the news. A few of them did mention it, and a couple of them even had it as a favourite show, which shocked me. But most of the time they're influenced by entertainment mass media. So that's the area. And it is helping a bit. I mean, all those crime shows, which 79% of my 10 to 12-year-olds watched, even though they're for age 15 plus, they actually are glamorising forensics. And that has, and worldwide, it's attracted more forensic scientists, probably more than we know what to do with now. And it also attracts girls to science. So, you know, even though the glamorous portrayals aren't really accurate, at least it's, you know, turning some people onto science. But I'm sure we can do better out there in the entertainment media than that too.
Okay, we'll take a question. If I just go to the far corner there for the first one.
Thanks, Graham. I'm Alan Mackay from the Group of 8 universities. A few years ago, our Vice-Chancellors, including Professor Chubb, commissioned Professor Gavin Brown to do a review of maths and data and quantitative sciences teaching in the 8 universities. During that review that I worked with Gavin on, we were struck with accounts of teachers in primary school particularly who were less than enthusiastic about maths and science, and in fact were phobic about maths, and were passing on that phobia to children at a very early age. So the first of Gavin's recommendations was that our mathematics and our education faculties needed to work together, and maths faculties needed to teach maths to educationists, but you would have to choose your lecturers very carefully. The second comment that came out that didn't find its way into a recommendation, but I think is very relevant, is a conversation Gavin and I had about the personal characteristics and degree of introversion of particularly mathematicians, but it probably relates to a lot of the sciences, in that we are not blessed with great communication skills. Some are worse than others, but with a tendency to significant introversion, maybe we need a bit of help in selling the message to teachers, potential teachers, to parents, to the media generally. And I wonder whether any of our panel would like to comment on either of those issues.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting, as a catalyst reporter, it's something I've experienced quite a bit. The interesting thing, though, is if you go to America, almost everyone's an extrovert in the scientific world. Everyone can perform in front of the camera and talk and communicate. So I don't think Americans are genetically different. I think it is something that can be learnt, you know, and it's part of our culture, I suspect. But that's my point. Who would like to take on board that?
I'll just very quickly add that my colleague 2 doors down at USQ is working on maths anxiety and maths phobia. And yes, it is a very real phenomenon, and yes, it does take a lot of work to try and look at primary teachers in particular, pre-service teachers, and try to encourage them out of that phobia so they don't transmit it to the next generation. I agree, that's a real issue.
So one of the things which is puzzling me is that in the primary school syllabus, we've just heard that only 3% of the time is spent teaching science, and yet that's when scientific interest peaks. It's only later when we start teaching it, people get turned off it for some reason in secondary school. Now, I think it does go back to the point that these are inherently difficult disciplines. It is depressing when you can't do maths, and if you miss, Graham said earlier, if you miss, it's a vertical discipline, you miss something, it's very depressing, and students fall further and further behind. It may be that the charisma of the teachers is good. It may be that the skills of the teachers isn't good. But as Chris has said, you know, we shouldn't just pick on the teachers. To me, it's like being at a kid's soccer game where all the parents shout at the sidelines. Every parent is a coach, and they just shout, run faster, kick straighter, you know, follow the ball. And the kids can't respond because you can't just shout at people to make them better. I think that we've got to admit science and maths is difficult, And it's always going to be difficult, and we can't just say the reason is because all our teachers are hopeless. But we are getting scientists in schools, and I think the CSIRO, Scientists in School programs, I know for my own kids, they absolutely loved it at their primary school, and this inspirational stuff is very good.
Yeah, sure.
And I think Merlin's right. I think one of the issues is to do it sustainably. So when I was doing that report that was mentioned earlier for the Prime Minister, and I talked to a lot of teachers, so they enjoyed all those programs, and they enjoyed the CSIRO, Scientists in Schools program and so on, which is now Scientists and Engineers in Schools. But the problem was that they weren't adopting a range of, they'd go in, then they go somewhere else, and then they go somewhere else, then they might come back. So the visits weren't consistent enough. The other bit of advice I got when I was writing that report from teachers was don't talk about teaching maths in pre-service primary education because we wouldn't get any applicants anymore. And I checked it out as best one could in the short time I had, and that was the view that was there, that there was this phobia, there was this sort of sense that in a way people were choosing study options on whether they liked or didn't like maths, consequence of which is when some of them end up as teachers, then of course they do transmit that phobia, that fear, that whatever to students at the very stage when we need to be making sure that they do embrace it. The other thing was that the transition from primary, no matter how well we adjust primary, if we aren't having an essentially seamless continuum into early junior secondary, then it'll all be for naught. So a lot of the primary programs that people have developed up, and we've talked a bit about some of them, and they work really well, and the young kids get really switched on by what they're seeing because science is actually being demonstrated as it's much more closely to how it's practiced in primary school. And then they go into junior secondary and they get switched off really very quickly. And then of course they go to university and they get checked out by the professor to make sure they're going to be good honours students and PhD students for them, and if they aren't, they get ignored.
You hold on to that microphone.
By and large, I'll generalise, of course.
Now look, we'll do a question from Twitter here. So David Geelan has tweeted in, one of the things making teaching less attractive is excessive paperwork / documentation. How do we make space / time for teaching? I guess the question there is there an issue that teaching at school has become a lot of hard work these days? And do we need to address that in some sense? Is it going to be attractive to PhD graduates? Who wants to take that on board?
So I think it's not just at high school. By my own experience at university, we sometimes drown in a sea of paperwork as well. And perhaps the one way is to get better support staff to actually help with all that paper pushing and almost bureaucratic work that nobody really likes, least of all teachers. So perhaps that's one thing to think about in that space.
Okay, we'll move on, and more questions from the floor here. Yes, right there in the middle. We'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, I'm Manju Sharma from the University of Sydney. I'd like to comment on teaching within the faculties of science at universities. I would come back to the comments made about valuing teaching and the need to value teaching within the context of the research culture. And this comes back to also Jade's comment about the ways in which science is actually taught so that it is more interesting and engaging, because that takes a time and investment from the teaching staff. And there are staff who actually dedicate more of the time to the teaching, and there quite often are also the staff who actually do more of the outreach type activities as well, systematic outreach. There is outreach which is talks that the researchers go out and give, but the systematic outreach programs that faculties of science actually undertake, most of them tend to be by staff who are actually more focused on the teaching. So this value is really important. How is that value actually provided? I think the Office of the Learning and Teaching has actually done a great job with the fellowships and so on and the grants, because then that gives some sort of kudos in comparison to the IRCs and so on. But then the reward structures, because there aren't the ways in which those things are actually counted. So we find staff who are actually dedicated their time to these activities, but they sometimes find that they can't progress in their careers and so on. So that is really important. Also, I think in the faculties of science...
Maybe if we just answer that one question first.
So if I could mention you, the tension between research and teaching has run through universities in Australia for a long time. I think with electronic teaching, the balance will be redressed. I mean, I don't want to say too much, but I know Chris Tisdell is a good teacher because he had the initiative to start doing YouTube 5 years ago, and 2 million people have watched his stuff and 500,000 people have downloaded his book. For the first time, I have statistics that can demonstrate quantitatively how good teaching is. And I think the revolution in online learning is not going to destroy universities, but it's going to mean it's going to be impossible to be a poor teacher. Any poor teacher in the future will be exposed as such, whereas in the present, I admit there are some poor teachers, and there have been poor teachers at universities who could get by with being poor teachers. I don't think that will be the case in the future, and I think that's one of the most exciting things about the online courses.
Do you think there'll be some sort of promotion system within the university that puts more emphasis on teaching?
Yes, I think already people try very hard to get the balance right and to acknowledge teaching and research. But it's been so hard to measure teaching that I think the weight at most universities, and particularly in the international league tables about how universities are measured, they're always measured on research. I fill in the surveys myself, and they ask me, who's the best in chemistry? And I say something like Harvard, and they say, who's the best at teaching chemistry? Well, what do I say? I say Harvard as well, because I've got no other idea. But in the future, we'll find out how good they are, because all their courses will be online.
Well, there you go. Professor Tisdell, then I'm assuming it'll be maybe Dean Tisdell from the... Okay, you've got a question, the second back row there. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew Jasmine from The Conversation. I'd just like to make an observation and then a suggestion. The first one is, last night I attended a Academy of Science symposium about science in the media, and the same sort of discussion was there about the fact that particularly in the media, specialists were being taken out. Now, the same story in terms of specialists, and I'm talking about science correspondents or editors, health, environment, business, law, etc. The same case is replicated in the US and also the UK. So instead of complaining about it, I think we just have to accept that's the way the media is. It's not going to change. The media is in crisis. The options really are new ways of communicating science, and obviously the Conversation does one of those things. All the panelists, I think, have written for the Conversation. We have 6,000 people. We talk about few voices. We have 6,000 people who've contributed, 6,000 people who've contributed extremely well and are now part of the national conversation. So this is a new voice. We just opened the UK as well. Same thing going on there. This is new, brand new. And Merlin, who's written for us, will tell you that one of the reasons he writes is not just to explain what's going on in terms of his area, but to actually inspire students as well to study science and study his particular area, genetics. The suggestion is as follows. I was recently in Los Angeles, and there was a discussion about STEM, and one of the speakers there was will.i.am, the lead singer of Black Eyed Peas. And he has got a demand-driven approach, which is to actually tell kids, particularly disaffected youth in urban areas, that getting into science and engineering and mathematics is actually a great way out of the ghetto, as it were. It's a great way to get a job. And he talks about the importance of learning developing skills as a developer, web developers. These are the real kind of demand-driven jobs that he thinks we need to get more kids into it. So my suggestion, because he's been incredibly powerful in terms of the debate on STEM in the US, is this. I suggest that Ian Chubb brings out a rapping record of some kind, that he becomes an international star and inspires the youth of Australia to get into science and teaching.
Grab that microphone. Hop to it. Yeah.
In what do I wrap it?
You want to know what key?
No, what paper? So I gave a speech a few weeks ago where one of my very keen and avid speechwriter people put in a reference to black-eyed peas and will.i.am, and I thought it was food. And I thought, why have they got this bit in here about food? But it turned out, of course, that what he'd done was donate several £100,000 to set up a scheme to support science. I will get some of these details wrong, but broadly, science in the East End of London, parts of London, with a specific view to get people who were otherwise disadvantaged socially, economically, probably certainly educationally, and to give them a start. So I thought it was wonderful. So in my speech I used it. I referred to him as will.i.am, not William, and I knew that black-eyed lettuce or whatever it was by then I knew it wasn't food. But if people do that, and people who have that sort of, as it were, social awareness, and can push things which are sort of outside their own immediate area of expertise and capability, then I think it's really good. And one of the things that we lack in Australia, I mean, we've been pretty introverted in the discussion, talking about, teachers and scientists, and do they get out enough, and do they talk and speak well enough in public and so on. But what we also need is people to stand up alongside us and say this is important. And that's what he's done. And I think it's unbelievably commendable that somebody, who with his persona, his profile, would actually do that and not only do it but support it. So one of the things that I think that we have to do is work much better with other sectors of the community. We've got to get other parts of the economy understanding that employing somebody with a degree in chemistry, with a major in chemistry, is actually employing a very intelligent person who understands a lot of things about process and evidence and all of that we talked about before. But we need other people to support it, otherwise we're preaching to the choir. And whilst that's good and entertaining and good fun, and we can sort of, slip into anecdotes, the real issue is when we get other people saying, this is too important to let lapse. We can't be inert. There's no sense of entitlement. We've got to earn what we're going to do in the future, much more probably than we ever have in the past. And this is a part of the process, but it's getting all those other people too. And then once I understand all that, I'll buy the right wrapping paper.
I see you've grabbed the microphone there. I assume you're not going to rap, but you want to make a point.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I think Andrew and Ian, you've both hit on a really important point, is this kind of wider acceptance of engaging people in science and research. There's a real challenge around that, and speaking as a researcher, we are not encouraged and we are not rewarded for partaking in that kind of exercise. So, I write for you guys as well, and I do all sorts of outreach, what you might call outreach activities. There's no framework in the things that I get judged upon and get my grants on and get my job from for those kind of activities. And in fact, it's actively discouraged by most people. I mean, I get all sorts of strange looks from various senior people for doing this kind of thing. So it's kind of seen as a hobby for most of us. But it's incredibly important, I agree.
Look, I'd just like to make the quick point as well that, the traditional media is kind of falling apart, if you want to put it that way. But I see that as kind of an opportunity for scientists. I mean, that's a chance for you guys to get your voices out there, not filtered through journalists, So I think for you, it's tough for us, but it's great for you guys. We had a follow-up question just right at the back there.
Yeah, hi, Richard John from Griffith University. Excuse my voice, I'm a bit sick. My question's to Professor Chubb. There's been some interesting thoughts and ideas brought up today. I particularly like the one from Rachel, where she talked about the critical thinking skills, the analytical skills, the problem-solving skills, and how science and maths is probably the best vehicle for people sort of generating those skills. Those skills are required in everyday life. Those skills are required in every job. those skills are required, and the knowledge around that is required in all the big issues that you raised as well, Ian. So it seems to me that kids staying in science just seems to make sense for all those reasons. But why aren't they? Who's influencing the kids' decisions? And more importantly, who's influencing the influencers? So what's our narrative in this country about why kids should stay in science?
So there are a lot of partial answers to the question. I think it was in January of last year, I was opening a maths conference for honours and PhD students at UNSW. And before I stood up to speak, the MC asked the 100 or so people there, honours and graduate students, whether they'd studied maths directly contrary to the advice and hopes of their parents. And 2/3 of them put up their hand. When you look then at other surveys, who influences study choices of students, somewhat to probably our collective surprise, parents have a great deal of influence. So it goes parents, teachers, peers, and so on, down a list. So on the one hand, you've got parents who, for all sorts of good intentions, I'm absolutely sure, are saying to their kids, however gifted they might be in maths, don't do maths because. So why would that be? Well, in part it's because we pigeonhole people very early in this country. We have them making choices, essentially choices that influence their careers when they're about 10 or 11 years of age. 14 or 15 years of age, another choice. When they go choosing what to study at university, they've got to make another choice. But by then the paths are getting very narrow because of choices made earlier. So one of the things that I think that we need very much to do is to do what they do in some other countries that are quite enlightened in this regard, and that is to ensure that the community on the one hand, and we've talked about that, but employers particularly on the other, talk about how they welcome intelligent people with high skill sets, high value skill sets into their organisations because of what they can do, not specifically what they know about whatever discipline it was that they chose to major in. And I think we've got to break down the walls between these pigeonholes and get it to be a much more fluid and open space so people can choose. They can study what interests them, but it doesn't overly restrict, it will to some extent, but doesn't overly restrict their career choices later. And I think it's an important point that we really do need to work hard at, and I don't think that we're doing it at the moment. So, you know, I talk to employers, they say to me things like, one group said to me, oh, you know, graduates are no use to us for at least the first 4 years of their employment with us. So I did actually say to this particular person that I'd been around so long I would remember that the people who employed him said the same thing about him. And what had he done about it in the meantime? And the answer was nothing, it's the government's responsibility. Well, one of the things that we've got to grasp here is that this is actually a partnership. It's between all the bits of the education sector formal, it's between the informal that sits alongside it, and it's about government and employers and business actually working out what we want to achieve and then the processes by which we achieve it. And then we will change when we do that. At the moment, the processes are too often seen to be the ends and not the means, because the end isn't clearly defined except that somebody's not much use for 4 years. Well, I don't think that's good enough, and the rest of the world is changing more quickly than we are, and if we don't change, we will be left behind. So, a lot of work to do.
Okay, look, we'll just take a question on Twitter before we go. So it's for Chris, from Karina Judd. Does this penchant towards online indicate good resources are just too expensive normally?
I think that the good resources, as in traditional resources.
I assume it's it's that case of it's online is actually very cheap versus face-to-face teaching is quite expensive.
I'm not so sure about that. I think with the online resources there is a huge upfront cost, but that cost declines as time goes on. So if you put, my view is that if you put a lot of effort and a lot of money into carefully planning and creating the resources, they will pay you back for years to come. So, I don't. Certainly, face-to-face teaching and traditional models are not cheap, but the new models that I propose are certainly there's an enormous upfront cost or a significant upfront cost, but the cost declines over time.
Yeah, and especially if you're talking about more sophisticated online tools, they're quite expensive to produce initially, but then you've got them for a long time.
That's right, and a lot of development probably as well. And because it is quite a young field, we're still experimenting and still working out what the best path is.
Okay, thank you. Back to the floor here. I should mix it.
Why wrapping up there doesn't have a W in front of it.
We'll go to the far end.
Thank you very much. Hi, Craig Cormack from CSIRO. A question I'd ask to the whole panel, do we put enough scientific rigour into understanding the kids we're now talking about? Because we know across society we don't all eat the same brand of biscuits, we don't all follow the same religions, we don't all follow the same football teams even, much to I know to Ian Chubb's chagrin that we're not all Sydney Swans supporters. Why do we treat the kids as if it's one homogenous group, overwhelmingly? And we talked that example to Will.i.am, clearly was looking to a different group. Do we know enough about the values, the influences, the impacts of all those different types of kids across Australia so we can actually apply some scientific rigour to what we need to do to motivate at different levels and different groups and different segments within those?
Who would like to take that one?
I can maybe speak to that one. I think you've raised a really important point in terms of where's the actual child or the young adult in this equation, and that they don't all fit into the same kind of mould, that there are a number of individual differences that can influence how they'll engage in a particular environment or not. Those kinds of things, I think that's an excellent point to raise. And I don't think there's a simple answer to it, because one of the real issues with educational research is it's really hard to actually conduct, very highly controlled studies. It's unethical to, give one really good intervention to one group of kids and then not to another group of kids. And, it's even unethical to put them on a wait list like we might do in another discipline, because if they've got an assessment piece, which is, going to be earlier on versus later on, that is really an issue there. So I think you've raised a really good question. I don't think we've quite figured out exactly how we can go about getting that scientific evidence just yet, which is kind of ironic.
Okay, right over here on the right.
Thank you. Is it on? Oh, yes. Thank you. Stephen Bigger from Victoria University. When it comes to inspiring students and teachers, I was wondering if one of the other elements we might consider is some of the big stories behind the big science in terms of the personal stories that go behind the science. Because many of these are arguably as interesting as the actual science itself, and indeed it has a lot of the elements, I think, that would be of interest to young people and old people alike, such as teams, the first to achieve something. Now, I realise that the science curricula are ever so crowded, but I guess given the fact that, and there may not be room for that type of discussion in our classes, but given the fact that I guess scientific knowledge is exponentially increasing, we're going to have to in the future, I guess, think of ways of teaching people how to teach themselves correctly in the sciences anyway. And so perhaps we could make a little bit of room for some of those interesting type background stories.
I'd like to speak to this one. I agree with you, and I certainly feel that we need science as a human endeavour is part of the curriculum, and I think we need to beef that up so that children become more aware of some of the stories behind science. And personally, I'd like to clear out some of the crowding of the curriculum to focus on the big ideas instead of on a lot of the little fiddly bits of facts of knowledge that they can acquire for themselves when they need them, rather than being, force-fed them. And so that's part of our idea, and I'm very much in favour of a spiral curriculum, so that, as I said, the atomic theory at year 4, you're not teaching them everything about atomic theory then, but you're starting them off and engaging them with the idea, and then you revisit it, and then you revisit it. So you gradually build. Instead of, at the moment, we've got a very one-shot approach to education. They only meet something once, and then it's gone. And that's not how real science is. It's not how real life is either. It's not an apprenticeship model where you engage and you practice and you engage and you practice. So all of those things would help clear out the curriculum. But the other thing is, I think we also need that very positive model of science in the classroom, so people understand what scientists really do, and really, as Ian said, practice it in the way in school that it is practiced in real life, and engage in those conversations, and then have the critical thinking skills, coming back to Rachel, to then be able to look up on the internet and find out what they need to know, sift through the good and bad sites. And obviously kids are, trying to do this. As I said, I had a large number in my sample who were willing to try this for themselves. That's the sort of skills we need to be fostering, not ramming in more and more knowledge.
And in the process, de-nerdify, we use that word, the science.
Yeah, hold on for the microphone there, yeah.
And I guess in the process, de-nerdify, if I can use such a word, the scientist.
That would be really good. And in fact, now I don't want to media bash, obviously, but there is a bit of a tendency in the media that the only story that they portray is the long-suffering scientist who has battled for years and has now finally made a breakthrough. And so they tend to push that, which kids go, oh, well, that's not me. I can't do that kind of thing. We don't talk enough about the scientists who are working and are finding out things, on a much more regular basis than 10 years of hard work before they finally, crack something. So I think, again, that's another aspect that we need to address.
Okay, I think we've got a couple of other panel members that want to talk here.
Yep.
You go first, Darren. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, that science is a human endeavour, and we hear the word engagement time and time again, and the best way to engage is through that human endeavour. And I think it also goes towards demystifying the process of science and how science is done. It's done by people, not by big boxes with flashing lights on it. And in some ways, online type approaches are helping people like me engage more with primary and high school students, and it's fascinating. It's when you get hold of these kids and they have a direct line to a scientist, you can see them switch on straight away. And the ability of them to just ask a really simple question and to give them the power to ask that simple question is really powerful.
And Ian.
I was just going to comment on the science as a human endeavour. As this strategy that I referred to earlier that we're sort of drafting up now, one of the things that we're looking at and could well end up in there is a recommendation that we develop much more coherently this notion of citizen science. One of the things that I'm aware of in other countries is that in the UK, for example, citizen science is a much more elevated and more cohesive activity. So what that means is, and we have bits here in Australia, some of which are really very good. There's one to do with marine science that came out of Tasmania and sits across bit of southern Australia, and there's Atlas of Living Australia and so on, where people who know it exists can send in information or a photograph or whatever, get a species identified, they collect data, they contribute data, so they're actually part of the scientific process. And it seemed to me, when you think about how do you, if you get the early bits of your education system right and you get people interested in science, and then they go off to be in some other career, take some other career path, just to keep them engaged at a level that they feel comfortable with, because it can be done on a Saturday arvo when they're walking up Black Mountain or whatever it might be, that they can sort of engage in a process which is formal without being grossly formal and red tape-ish and intrusive and all the rest of it, and just keeping that level of activity and level of engagement going. And it does, and as I say, it might end up in the strategy, it might not, depending on how the chips fall when they fall, but in terms of the principle of the notion that you engage the community more actively in accumulating data and interpretations and understanding on a purely voluntary basis, but an avocational basis, then you're actually beginning to change the ground rules a little bit by the way in which scientists communicate with the citizens, because at the end of the day you're going to have scientists saying it's a kookaburra or it's a magpie or it's a hitherto never seen before spider. And so this is an important sort of link that you can establish in that way. And it works quite successfully in some other places, and so we're looking at it quite seriously.
Well, look, we've probably got time for one last very quick question. Just there, third row back. Yeah, we'll bring a microphone to you.
Okay, I'll cut it shorter. I was going to go on for
All right,
half
that would
an
be
hour,
good.
I must admit. But
Yeah.
Look,
You've used up your time already. Yeah.
My name's Giles Thomas. I'm from the University of Tasmania, and I think, first of all, it's great to have this conversation today in a building called Inspire, because that to me is one of the real key things here. And I suppose, I go out to schools quite often. I'm an engineering academic, and what I really see is a lot of kids not making that connection, and they really question, why on earth am I doing this? Why should I be inspired to study maths? And so, what I see that we've got to make a really big step change here. So I'm interested, just very briefly, some ideas from the panel in terms of how we can change the cycle of the maths teachers going through that same thing at school, going to university, going back into the classroom without really picking up the real applications of maths and science and being able to inspire the kids with those applications.
Sounds like a big question to me, but it's someone who wants to give a very brief answer to that.
I think you need to contextualise and work on those teachers before they get into the classroom. And I think the OLT is working on that with their current or about to be announced round. So I think that's the key, get them before they get into the classroom. Those people who are already in the classroom can do professional development, and so we can paint the bigger picture, we can show them the applications, we can contextualise through things like PD.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much. I wish we could keep going. In fact, I guess at afternoon tea, for those of us who are physically in the room here, that can keep going. Been a wonderfully stimulating discussion with some really great ideas there, I think. So I hope everyone found that very useful. I'd now like to welcome to the lectern Susie Hewlett, General Manager, Office Learning and Teaching, who'll say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Graham. It was great to have you here today. On behalf of the Office for Learning and Teaching, I'd like to thank the Minister for her welcoming message this afternoon. I'd like to thank the Chief Scientist and the rest of the panel for their fascinating contributions and their responses to our questions. I'd like to thank the Conversation, who do such a great job of bringing the work of our academics and researchers to a much broader audience and to make sure that we're not just always preaching to the choir. I'd like to thank the Inspire, and I completely agree with you. It's great to have the symposium here again at the Inspire Centre at UCAN. And also, I'd like to again thank Graham for emceeing today. It was great to have somebody with a science background. I come from the social sciences, so I appreciate you being here and able to contribute in the way that you did. This is the second symposium that we've had with the Conversation, and it was on the back of the engagement that we got from the sector in our first symposium on MOOCs and online learning that we decided to do the same thing again. We had engagement of over 100,000 people in the first symposium, both through the readership of the articles, through engaging here in the Inspire Centre online, and also engaging after the symposium with the material that we had on the website. And I just wanted to share with you that we've already had, a couple of days ago, I think we've already had readership of 35,000 of the articles that have been put in through this series. So as you can see, the quality of in fact, have we got an updated figure, Debbie, at this point? to be provided. We'll keep you up to date on their website and on ours. So again, where to from here? We don't like to let the what comes out of these symposiums remain here in the room. So the articles will stay up on the Conversation website. We'll put the live stream up onto the Conversation website, and also we will put all of our material into an app. So the material from the last, and it will be illustrated by this great stuff that Gavin does on the walls. Isn't it fabulous that you can use the walls in that way? Yeah, thanks. So with that, and I am not going to be making any announcements out about the maths and science program that we're managing at the moment, but I'd like to invite you all to come and join us at afternoon tea. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's eat and have coffee.